born in Manitoba, and in 1922 we moved out here, and I was only a year and a half old at the time. I figured it was after one winter in Manitoba, it'd be a good idea to bring my family out here. And so we came out, and we got a place to live in. It was a rental place on right at the foot of Basin Bay Road. And I know that's outside of the Royal Oak area, but I'll move back in here with some comments later on. But we were, at the bottom of Beaver Lake Road, or Basin Bay Road, and at that, back in those days, it was just, we were right on the beach, but there wasn't any Lochside Drive or highway to Sydney. It was the road to Sydney at that time was East Saanich Road. So and out there I was there for a few years, and then we moved more up towards the farm buildings, and we were up there. Got into a house up in there, but being down there in Basin Bay, this rental house was for $18 a month. It's a pretty good rent nowadays, because about 2 years ago I saw a house for sale, and it was just about in the same location that this house, our first house, was in. And so I Googled it up, as you say, and I found out that they were asking $1,050,000 for it. So I figured the $50,000 went to the real estate people, and but it had been it was a rebuilt house by that time, but that would have been built back 100 years ago, original house. So as my father was employed back there in Morden, Manitoba, he got this position out here in North Saanich with the same company, with the federal government. So that was my place of residence that I remember for a lot of years. I went to North Saanich schools, all 12 grades in the one. I shouldn't say in the one building, because the grades 1 to 3 were in a little room. We called it the little room off to the side, and which had been the original one that they built for North Saanich for the whole school, all the children. Well, it grew from that, and then they put the other big building in there. And so I was there for the 12 years, had 1 year at Victoria College after that, and then decided that I'd go into the agricultural field, and went down to the Ontario Agricultural College at Guelph, and I was there for a couple of years. War was along by that time, because I graduated from high school in '39, and so I joined the RCAF and was a navigator in the and ended up in number 6 Group Bomber Command over in Yorkshire, and did my number of trips required for a tour, 28 trips, there and back. That has a meaning to it, you know. Went there and bombed and came back safely. And I met my wife over there. She didn't, but that doesn't mean she was a war bride in that sense. She wasn't an English war bride. She came from Kitchener, Ontario. She was pretty good at typing, and so she went after she joined the Air Force. She went overseas and assigned to number 6 Group headquarters. And so, long story, won't go into it, but through a blind date over there in the city of York, in Yorkshire, I met my future wife. And then after the war, she came out here for a visit. We got engaged and got married in the fall of '47. our first place of residence was down in Gonzales Hill, Gonzales area there, and Richmond Road, and it was just rentals there until we could, we decided we'd be able to build a house down there. We had a greenhouse, 2 greenhouses there on the corner of Lillian and Richmond, and being there was a spare lot right next door, and so my mother said, "Why don't you build a house there?" Well, that's a bright idea. Why didn't I think of that? We did build a house. Payne and Townsend were building houses all up and down Shelburne Street at that time, so we got them to build a nice 2-bedroom house. By this time we had 3 children, and then by 1953, we'd been in the house for 2 or 3 years or so, twins came along. And that made 5 children and 2 parents in a 2-bedroom house. So that's where I started looking around for land, and that's and I found in a real estate store window down there in Victoria, they had advertised this place out on Beaver Lake Road, and that was sounded like it was out in the country and be a good place to maybe look around. So it had the 716 Beaver Lake Road on it. They should never put that on, because I took that address and went out and I found the Sheldrake property down here next to Roy Jules. Remember Roy? Right. He was the farrier. That was a new term to me, even though I had been in agriculture for a while. Lots of horses back on the farm, but yeah, Roy Jewell, good neighbor. He took me into the emergency ward once at the Jubilee Hospital. I had a cut in my hand. And anyway, Roy Jewell's house is still there. That's the, what is it, GVRD? Their Parks building, and you know that, I guess. Parks building is there for all their municipal parks. And so that's where I went out and made a deal with, I never knew I don't think I knew your dad's name.
Fred.
What? Fred? He and his wife were there, and I made a deal with them. And the deal went through, and we paid, and got ourselves all set and moved out. There was an acreage in the back. I think it was we got 4 acres there. There was an additional acreage in the back, which was 9 acres, and that was bought. And it was agreed that somebody else would go up for sale. So, Mr. H.M.S. Bell, which I thought that was really a very imaginative name. H.M.S. Bell bought the property for, I don't know, environmental purposes. He liked the birds and he liked the water and the swamp, and I use the term swamp in a very loving sort of way. Anyway, there's lots of water around, as Grant will verify. So we got going there, but I guess I should tell you that the real estate guy came along, salesman came along in his nice convertible a couple of months later and wanted his money. And anyway, some fast talking back and forth, and I didn't see why I should be paying money when I did all the work myself and paid the lawyers and so on. Anyway, I got out of that, and so I wanted to build a greenhouse, and there was a nice flat area there in front of to the side of the house. I should point out that there was another road allowance. Oh, there was a road allowance between Jules and ourselves. He used that as a roadway, just an access driveway into his house. And right now, it has been developed since then, though. I'm talking about 1956. It's been developed since then, and it goes back to the riding ring, back in used with the horse people. But that on the other side of the property was the VNS, the Victoria and Sydney Railway right-of-way. No tracks, but just it's all part of the big trail that goes around the lake. What is it, 10K, something like that? And that, yeah, just it cuts through our old property there and back to the lake and so on. Yeah. So I built a greenhouse on the property there. I could get in a 160-foot length of greenhouse very nicely, 30 feet wide. But where was I going to get the materials for it? I heard that Mr. Green of Capital Iron was not destroying, removing a number of large greenhouse complexes throughout Saanich here. They had been built. The Chinese had seen their opportunity to move in here back about 1921, and the number of the Chinese people had families established these large greenhouse growing operations where they would have, mostly in tomatoes, I think it was, but later on in cucumber and melons and that sort of thing later on. There was, so I got my greenhouse materials from Mr. Green, and the glass too. And I had that put up in a year or two. My father retired from his work about the same time, but he liked the outdoor life, and he gave me he was just like a hired help, sort of a volunteer, unpaid sort of thing. But he would come up every day, put in almost an 8-hour day, and he never would eat with us. At lunchtime, he wouldn't eat with us. And we found out afterwards it was the noise of all the children around, and he just liked to sit in his car and have his lunch out there. Mother washed up all the glass that went into that greenhouse in a wash tub, square wash tub, and washed up all the dirty old glass that came from the other place, had to be washed. I have a note here about the ventilators, and the ventilators always have to have ventilators in the greenhouse, and they're every 6 or 8 feet long. You need to have a large ventilator and a stick, and you push it up every day. But anyway, that didn't last very long, and I heard they were just what's the term? Dismantling, tearing apart a greenhouse, a conservatory out at Royal Roads. That's the right term for these fancy places where they grew the palm trees and so on inside. But anyway, it was a castle in those days. It was known to us. It was one of Dunsmuir's houses for his wives, or his wife, I can maybe put it that way. Anyway, I got the ventilating equipment from Mr. Green again, and that was a great asset. You come home from being in town in the afternoon, and the ventilators had to be closed, and you just I say, Dennis, go out and close the ventilators. Well, he'd go out there and work this wheel around. It was just the worm gears, and it was easily operated, and he just wheel this down. The whole 160 feet, both sides would come down. that was that was a good asset. I'll just throw in here, or put in here, I didn't know where to talk about it, but we just came through Beaver Lake Road here a few minutes ago, just to check out the old home site, you know. And down at the end of the road here, across the road where you come on to West Sandish Road, there's a house in there. And I know it was an old roadhouse. And Dennis came up with the name of the people that had been in it. It was Bertram. And the Bertrams lived in that house. But it was a roadhouse, just like I envisaged it, like Prairie Inn down there at Sandiston. And but it doesn't have a pub or anything like that. But it was where, I guess, you people would know more about this than I, but it would be where in the horse and buggy days, so to speak, it would be a stopping station on the way out to Deep Cove, points north, and just like over there at Sandiston. When we were here and back in the 50s and 60s, I'm pretty sure there was a barber in there. Is that right? I see some nodding heads. Okay. Anyway, that was the roadhouse there. Now, a couple of adventures back here on the Beaver Lake Road property. My son Dennis is here with us today, but he can crouch down his chair if this is too much for him. But my wife and I, we asked our children, after leaving this area here, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, we had to go into town, but we had them write their memories of what their experiences on Beaver Lake Road, because they were all, well, they weren't all, but a number of them were in teens. By this time, we had 8 children out here. Okay, and a number of them were teenagers, and this happened one morning back in 1956. I think we just arrived, really, within the year, anyway. Shortly after and Dennis is writing this, and he says, in the late summer of '56, shortly after we had moved from Richmond Road out to Beaver Lake Road, I decided to get up early one beautiful sunny Sunday morning before Mom and Dad were out of bed. I found myself exploring the old barns at the back of our new property. Between the two barns was a 30-foot-high Douglas fir tree, which seemed to have the branches spaced just perfectly for climbing. At 9 years old, I seemed to have a fascination with exploring and climbing anything in sight, especially this newfound adventureland we had just moved to. As I neared the top of the tree, I noticed that the top had been cut off and that something metal was sitting on it. I'm looking at you, Grant. No? Did you have a brother, Bill?
No, Lynn.
Lynn?
Yeah.
Okay.
3 years old.
Oh, okay. The mystery deepens here. Okay, he noticed something is sitting on it, so he said, in my natural curiosity, I reached up to grab it. All of a sudden, this metal object snapped, and a searing pain shot through my fingers. They were caught in the jaws of an animal leg hold trap, which had been chained to the tree. I started to scream at the top of my lungs, as loud and as hard as I could, and I was about 500 feet away from our house. But it wasn't long before Dad came running out in his pajamas. Late sleeper, you know. He climbed the tree and somehow was able to climb to the very top of the tree, which was only 4 inches thick at the top, and with both hands was able to open up the jaws of the muskrat trap. We think the trap had been set to catch a large bird, and I think there was lots of eagles around and that sort of thing. Because the jaws, which would snap, closed around the leg and were covered with rubber garden hose. I was really lucky because if the jaws hadn't been covered with the rubber hose, my fingers would have been broken or even cut off. And in the course of time out there, the boys had to find something to do besides climb trees. Well, and build. So they decided to build a fort, and Dennis. This was principally Dennis's fort because he was the oldest one, and so I'll just read you what he says about his experience in this fort. One of my favorite pastimes at Beaver Lake Road was to climb trees and either build swings or forts. And I noticed when we had first moved there that an old 3-inch square platform was about 10 feet up the tree. Grant? Beside the path to the barns behind the house. Oh, that was a different. Okay, there was one back in there. I instantly had in my mind the idea that I could build a tree fort. Way better than that one. Okay? So eventually I chose 3 trees about 5 feet apart in the shape of a triangle. And this was out in the front part of the property towards Beaver Lake Road. They were about 50 feet from Beaver Lake Road in the bush. I remember nailing 3 2x4 boards from tree to tree, about 5 feet high, higher than my head, and then nailing boards on top to form a floor to stand on. Next, I nailed 3 more 2x4s from tree to tree to form the next level, about 5 feet above the first. At last, it ended up being 3 levels with a hole in each of the floors to climb through, and a short 2x4s nailed to the tree to use as a ladder to climb up from one level to the other. This was our tree fort. You can still see a 2x4 or so nailed to those same trees, only they're about 30 feet in the air. He said, I also remember finding an old length of 1.5-inch black polyethylene water pipe that we laid on the ground extending from the fort over towards the road where some large boulders were located. We put the end of the pipe out of sight under the boulders and found that when we yelled into the pipe from the fort, it sounded as if somebody was under the rocks. One weekend, we waited in our fort for some unsuspecting people to walk along Beaver Lake Road. We yelled into the pipe, "Help, help, I'm caught under here. Please help me, help, help." Where's the other part of that? Oh, the people stopped and went over to the rocks, and we could see from our fort that they were trying to figure out how someone got under those rocks. It was great, he thought. Okay, on with our story. I grew geraniums, was the main crop there in the greenhouse. All this time I was working, at this point I was working for the forestry lab people on Burnside Road as a full-time working job because we needed money to survive, and that along with the greenhouse, it worked out fine. So I have a note here about this Royal Oak Post Office. You remember when the Royal Oak Post Office was here? And I was, the geranium business got so large that I couldn't get all the geraniums that I needed, so I had to send away for either rooted cuttings or calloused, and I could bring them up from the States. So this particular shipment, I ordered 15,000 from a place down in Gardena, California, which was close to San Diego. Okay, well that was fine, and I waited and waited. 2 weeks later, they didn't arrive for about 2 weeks, and of course they got to come through customs down here. When I went to customs and found out what had happened, they had sent them to Royal Oak, Michigan, which is kind of out of line. And they were really yellowed off and didn't look good at all. 15,000 of them. And so, but I thought, well, I'm going to put in a claim anyway. I better put in a claim, but I'll see what I can do with these little critters. And so I gave them a lot of TLC and was able to bring them back into color, cut some roots on them. And I must have saved about 90% of them. So I had close to 15,000 there, but in the meantime I reordered another shipment. So I had, and they came Royal Oak, BC, and so I had 30,000, which at the beginning of the year I didn't plan on that many. But with this big greenhouse I had, I was able to grow them all on, and in those days I had enough customers. I was growing wholesale then, and there was lots of opportunity to dispose of them, and so it wasn't a disaster after all. But it was interesting. Royal Oak, Michigan, and I'd heard of Royal Oak, Michigan, but never in that context. I guess I should explain why out here in Royal Oak, we had 8 children in a 3-bedroom house. And I got a picture of that. I was scrambling around for some pictures. There's a picture you can see. You can come up and look at them later on. But there's the picture of where Grant used to live in this flat-roofed house. And but this was the first year, and the farm buildings were still around. This was in the when we had a good snowfall there, by the looks of it. My old 1948 Fargo truck was there, and you remember the roosters, the rooster of the bantams. You had bantams there, and boy, that rooster sure woke you up early in the morning. Yeah. Yeah, and that was the and so up the side here, they had the greenhouse. With all the congestion out there of extended family, and it was before the older ones had started to move away, we moved into a much larger house out in Lamson Street in Victoria. I really missed the greenhouse operation and all the fun that we were having out here. And I got a job with Saanich Parks, and got in there as a parks foreman, and I was there for 10 years or so. About that time, but after working in Saanich for a while, another opportunity for greenhouses came up, and the Lum family. Remember the Lums? Ed Lum was Reeve or mayor, I guess. By that time, there's no more Reeves out here. He was mayor of Saanich. He had 2 brothers, Charlie and John. And by this time, they were operating, Ed was busy with the municipal business, but the other 2 boys were operating greenhouses, and they decided to sell this one off. And it was out on Santa Rosa, Santa Anita, Mariposa. All Spanish names, aren't they? Out in that direction. Strawberryvale. His school was just up the road there. It was 2 acres of glass. It was a large leap of faith for us. And I got another friend of mine who was supplied the finances more or less for this, and I supplied the expertise. And it turned out to be the largest greenhouse operation growing white spine cucumbers west of Medicine Hat. Well, when I first heard that, I said, "Why Medicine Hat? That's away in the middle of the prairies, middle of the winters, when the winters can be pretty tough back there. Medicine Hat sits right over top of gas fields, and the whole town is just, they just have to drill straight down, and they get all the natural gas that they need for heating purposes and so on. So that's why there was a large greenhouse complex there, able to grow flower. They grew great amounts of flowers and cucumbers. We were thinking the other day that white spine cucumbers are not quite as popular now as the Long English. Went into Thrifty's the other day, and there was a huge display of Long English cucumbers. We 2 acres of glass, four or five Chinese workers that went along with it, and they had a bunkhouse to live in on their own. And in the summertime, when things really got, and in the spring, we had access to 4 Chinese ladies that were really good. They just worked like men, and they knew all the procedures, and so it took a lot of the load off us, because we didn't know much about growing the cucumbers, but they did. And so they were very helpful to us there. And found out, too, just a matter of passing interest, that they had 4 boiler rooms burning number 2 bunker oil. And the big boiler, I guess you call them that, they're oil fired, but they came from the Crow-Gunnison mills that were down on Government Street. You know, the lumber mill, the Crow-Gunnison was down there, and they packed it in, and they picked up these heating plants for their greenhouses, and that's where I got that experience out there. Remember, Dennis remembers it too. Looking after the boilers there one night, and I had to start it up because of it was cold enough to do so, and it wouldn't light up like it was supposed to, and the oil started spreading, coming down along the concrete floor, and suddenly it did light up, and it lit up the floor too. But when that number 2 oil, when it catches fire, it bubbles, and it came out underneath, and so and it burned out all the electrical apparatus that was on front there supposed to help. And so I had to call the fire department. But all those places were built for Chinese height people. I was 6'2", and they were all about 5'2". So running down the stairs into the pit where the boiler room was, you can guess it, I just hit my head on top of the floor up there. And but I didn't know I was bleeding until the fireman came and said, "You're bleeding, and do you need some help?" Well, they patched me up, and but that's when your house is burning down, you don't think about bleeding or any of that sort of thing. We better move along here. The seed was planted in January the 4th. I still remember that. And they were producing by March, April. You were starting to pick your first ones. We were getting hundreds of cases a week. We had 2 trucks and they were trucks that had sides that could be removed at times when necessary. And we all the cucumbers there, cucumber plants, throughout the houses were top dressed with the soil was top dressed with manure, and the the Lums, they had made arrangements with the racetrack people out at Sandown, Mr. Diamond, remember? Out at Sandown to get, just for hauling it away. Price was right. So we'd send, or go out, I went out a few times, but then I found that Dennis and his friend, Paul Moulton, could do the same job. They both had driver's licenses, so I'd send them out to pick up, and then we'd stockpile it back at the greenhouse and so on. They would go out, and there's no such thing as bobcats or anything like that for front end loaders, and you just pitchforked it on. You forked it all with manure forks. That was, and that worked well. And then they'd bring in and pitch it all off again out here at the ranch. The thing was that I had reports there one day that there was 2 trucks seen racing along number 17 Pape Highway here, with each of them with a steaming load of manure in the back, and they couldn't figure out what was going on. Because they couldn't race very much anyway with their older trucks, and but I put 2 and 2 together and figured out the boys just wanted something, spice up life, and we just. I guess the steaming part happened when they had to stop at the traffic lights, and the people wouldn't appreciate that very much. Sort of like running along in a truck, behind a truck that has chickens, that are transporting chickens to the factory. And all the feathers flying, and the smell too. I'm getting close to the end here, but I have some stories here. But going back to this Beaver Lake property here, and Martin. Now Martin, we had twins along the way there. The 4th and 5th children were twins, and we had them in at 312 Richmond before we moved out here, and that was what we decided. Why we decided we better get a larger house. Martin, and he also had a brother. I'm getting mixed up in their 2 stories. They're both wild ones anyway. But this Fraser, he says this. Fraser was number 8. I remember the time when I wanted to experiment with making torches. One day I picked some bulrushes. Mother's, she just hated bulrushes because if they were brought in the house when they were old, and they just fell apart, the house was a mess. But anyway, one day I picked up some bulrushes which were in abundance because of the 2 swamps adjacent to the house. I soaked the bulrush in gasoline and I lit it. Great torch. Instantly I had a flaming torch. I played with this for a while, and it was time to go to the lake for a swim. So I flung the flaming torch down to the blackberry bushes. It's supposed to go out. Unfortunately, I hit the wooden bridge. Remember that, Grant? The wooden bridge behind the house there? Towards the barns? Which crossed the flow of water between the 2 swamps. I thought the torch was out, so I went to the lake. An hour or so later, I was out on a raft at the lake, and I hear fire engine sirens. I thought that there must be a grass fire, as they were most common this time of year, of course. Yes. When I went home later that day, I was informed that by my mother, that the torch I'd been playing with and thrown down by the bridge had set the bridge on fire. The sirens I heard were the fire department putting out the fire. I was more careful in the future, or maybe Dad did, or maybe Dad hid his gas can. But anyway, he must have, because when my friend Ricky Martin, who was the next door neighbor, and I wanted to have some fun by pouring gas on our shoes and lighting them. We couldn't find the gas. So, bringing up father, you know. About the 3 railways that went out through the peninsula here, and went through Royal Oak and right out to, the north end there. There's the BC Electric, which down here was known as the Interurban nowadays. And it went right through the farm, the experimental farm. And there was a station house there for people to get off and enjoy the park and so on, and then get back in and go back into Victoria. So, and that building is still out there and in the farm park right now. And that was just within spitting distance, as they say, within the house that we lived in. So that was a BC Electric, and that went right out to the chalet at Deep Cove. And that was torn up in 1926. There was the VNS went through the farm as well, Victoria and Sydney Railway, and that was the one that was the property line with our property over here at on Beaver Lake Road. And then there was the CNR, and a little story here about the CNR. The boys in Sydney got a neat little trick going with the CNR. CNR went right out to Sydney, to the mill out there, and picked up all the lumber and that sort of thing that had to come in to Victoria for shipping. Probably went to Ogden Point and so on. So they got the bright idea. If they hopped on the back of a train load of lumber, sight unseen, that they would be able to take a ride into Victoria. Well, what they did was that they would get off, at Quadra Street at Borden's there. The CNR passed over Quadra at that point, and they figured out that any bus coming out, or passenger carrying buses coming out from Victoria, would have to stop at that same intersection, stop, look, and listen, all those big signs that used to be there, and that they would hop off the train at that point, and when the bus stopped, they would hop on. The buses in those days had the ladder up the back, and on the top was the railings around and hold all your luggage, and so that's the way that worked. They would ride in, hop off the train it went across over Quadra Street, yeah, and then rode back to Sydney, have a good outdoor experience, going both ways. I thought that was pretty exciting. I haven't touched on Paul's the farm market down here. We were responsible for it was Hall's Market, and then it was the Plowshare, and then I got 3 pictures here of that. Oh, here, that was a roadside stand, and they had to build it 25 feet back from the road allowance. That's why it's so far back here. That was a rule that nobody except me had to follow. This was John Tall's property. It was an ex-nursery in here, good land. So that was my first sign. First sign there was just on pipes and so on. And then I don't have an awfully good. And then we put up Denison, I think it was Dan Potter. I don't know whether the Potter name involved in this area at all. But we went, excuse me, we went down to the beach, went down to Esquimalt Lagoon, and got a couple of logs off the beach that were about 50 feet long or so, and got them trucked back here, put them in the ground, built a sign around it, and that was a real good fixture. And that was between the ditch and the building. That was, and it's now, I think Georgie, is it Georgie's Cafe? George's Cafe down here, may have a different name by now. But yeah, we spent a few years there, and then we moved back over into Hastings Street. And Dennis had come back from working on the prairie for a while, and Medicine Hat brought some Medalta crockery back with him, and that's what we were selling in the roadside stand there for a while until we ran out of crockery, and he went into the irrigation business, and we developed the Halls Irrigation, which has been around here for a few years now. But Dennis, I retired back in 1987, and Dennis retired kind of in the last year or so. I think he's used as a consultant. It's still a very large part of another business. There's this one. How many of you remember the roller skating rink on the east side? Roller skating rink? Great, I got one. No? It was on the west side of Elk Lake. Go across Brookley Road, and then there was a road up the west side there. It was a roller rink, and there was a Wurlitzer there, I think it was, and you put the money in. But that was the greatest thing. I think we could have had more of that. You know, it was all big band music. Who could roller skate to the music, dance music nowadays anyway? I thought there'd be somebody here that could remember that. That was just before the war, I think, wasn't it? Yeah. Just as my last little observation here, if you'd like to go down Glencoe Drive sometime, that is towards the to the riding rink down there, there's a tree down there. One of the first trees was planted there by my father. He, at his retirement back in about 56, he brought with him from the farm some seeds, and I still had my greenhouse in Victoria at that time. And anyway, we developed these seeds, and they grew into this. It'd be a golden cypress, I guess, for lack of a more official term. And just as it came along here an hour or so ago, we had a look over, and it's still standing there. And I'm going to go back. Some years ago, we asked the GBRD if there was some way that we could just clear the blackberries away from the tree and just put a little post up or something with some recognition of my father's. No, you can't do that. I think they misunderstood whoever it was. One of the family had gone in and asked to do this. They thought that we were going to bring in a tree and plant it there. You're not allowed to do anything like that. A memorial in memory of somebody. Does that sound right? You're not allowed to do that. Or a bench. I'm going maybe too far there on that, but so I'm going to go in and see if we can't get some sort of an arrangement. Because the trees there, it's a beautiful tree. It's about, 40, 50 feet high now. Yeah, but it was just from seed. We put in on a property line that divided the 4 acres from the 9 acres. Yeah. Okay, that winds things up pretty well, and I'm glad to be here. I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time. I don't even know when I started, but well, that's an hour. Thank you very much.